So
Yes.
nice to have everybody here. I can see we have a good bunch of attendees who already joined. I'm sure a few of us are going to join a bit later. I think it's our last keynote session for the conference. There's still another session after, but it's a practitioner track. So so you have the chance for this to give the closing keynote in a way, and it's also the peak. Yes, it's also my peak as editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Forecasting. It was a great pleasure to have you accepting this invitation. So yeah, over the next hour, we'll have the chance to listen to this keynote. And for all attending, do not hesitate to post some questions in the Q&A. And at the end of the talk, I will go through the Q&A, reading the question, asking the question to Thordis, and then maybe add also some extra questions. Or I have some questions first to launch the discussion. So now let me introduce the keynote speaker. It's Thordis Thorarinsdottir. She's the Chief Research Scientist at the Norwegian Computing Center in Oslo, in Norway, for those who wouldn't know where Oslo is. More specifically, she's a research leader with climate and environment. She's also part of the leadership team for a new large center on climate prediction from 10 days to 10 years. And you will see it fits very well the topic of the talk and the use of these predictions in various private and public sectors. Thordis received a PhD in mathematical statistics from Aarhus University in Denmark, and she's had a very international career. Looking at her CV, she has been in the UK, Germany, US, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway. She's made a number of great contributions in terms of methods for forecasting within probabilistic forecasting and verification, but also with applications. And their core interests are within environment and climate. So it's a pleasure now to have her give this keynote talk, which is titled From Weather to Climate Predictions. Thordis, the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's see if this works out for us. There we go. And then if we do this, yes. Yeah, you should see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yes, thank you very much, Pierre. And hello, everyone. So we're gonna hear about weather and climate predictions.
Thordis, though, I think you're in a strange mode because we see the next slide. You're not in a full, let's say, slide presentation mode.
You're in presenter mode, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, now it's fine. Cool. Thank you.
Cool. Yes. Excellent. Good. Much better. So yes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole scale of weather and climate predictions, as Pierre mentioned. And I just wanted to start by setting the stage. So here are sort of the two things, the two types of weather and climate information that we're very used to seeing. On the left-hand side, we have weather predictions, which now is something that we all have in our pockets, on our cell phone, available at any time. Detailed predictions for weather from sort of right now until 10 days into the future. And we can get this for any location in the world. And if you can see, I don't know if you can see what it says there on that cell phone, but this is a typical weather forecast for Norway in October, 12 degrees and heavy precipitation with some clouds in the evening. And then on the right-hand side, we have the other extremes. We have the climate projections. So this is then not in itself a prediction. It is meant to give us plausible examples of what we might expect in the future, given some assumptions about emission scenarios. And specifically what we see here is from the 2013 report of the IPCC, where we see projections for global mean sea level rise from 2005 until 2100. So what we see there on the plot are the two sort of different extremes in the scenarios. There's the most optimistic scenario in blue and the most pessimistic scenario in red. And what is very typical of this, of course, is that the uncertainty grows as we go further into the future. And then there on the right of the plot, we then see the average projection for the last 20 years of the century for each of 4 different scenarios. And then in the middle there, in this time period from 10 days to 10 years, up until about 10 years ago, we used to have a gap in the available information. So this is beyond what weather predictions can do, and it is closer in time than it's really meaningful to talk about climate projections. So then what we have now to fill this gap is climate predictions, which are then more general predictions than we normally get in weather predictions, and often slightly different type of information. And we can sort of, in this context, when we think about the difference between weather and climate prediction, we can think about the climate as distribution of weather. So we move over to basically distributional prediction. And the example you see here is a climate prediction, seasonal outlook for October, November, and December for the Greater Horn of Africa, issued by the ICPAC Climate Prediction Center in Kenya. And what we see here is their prediction for the onset of the rainy season. And we see on the bottom of the region, sort of in the southern part of the region and in the eastern part of the region, where we have the red area, that means that the rainy season is predicted to start late. Whereas in the center, where we have the green region, the rainy season is expected to start early. So we see that this is kind of a very different type of information than today you're going to have 12-degree temperature. And then if we move over to think about a little bit of how we can present this information, often what happens is that the time resolution of the prediction changes when we move from right now to 100 years into the future. So the, excuse me. So most weather apps will give you hourly predictions for the first 3 days, and then they move over to 6-hourly predictions for the following week. And then when we move over to climate predictions, we talk about weekly averages, monthly averages, annual averages, and climate projections are on decadal averages. So while this sort of, we need to do this in order to keep skill in our predictions, the basics of the models that are underlying these predictions have very similar characteristics. So we have global models where we have a horizontal grid in latitude and longitude, and we have a vertical grid in height or pressure. And then on the grid points, we try to solve the physical processes that happen. And so these are different physical processes depending on where we are. So we have special processes for the atmosphere, for the land, and for the land-atmosphere interactions. And then there's sort of usually a separate part of the model that describes the physical processes in the ocean. And then we need to have interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere. For the weather predictions, these models are often simplified in that we assume that the ocean is fixed. And then we just try to model the changes in the atmosphere. However, when we move over to climate predictions, we can no longer make these assumptions because we can no longer say specific things about the atmosphere. It's too far into the future. So then what is done is basically they use climate models instead of weather models, because climate models have the ocean component and the interaction component. And then sort of a two-step approach is used, where in the first step, we look for slowly changing large-scale processes that are called teleconnections, And then we try to predict what these teleconnections do and how they're going to slowly change months into the future. And then in a second step, we try to understand what are the relationships between teleconnections and actual weather that we care about. And here's an example of maybe the most well-known of these teleconnections, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So that is an ocean current that runs there in this figure, just south of the equator, eastward towards South America. And, and depending on whether the El Nino is in a positive or a negative state, it will differently sort of have different effect on weather, in particular on precipitation. And what we see here in this figure is areas in blue where a strong El Nino will cause the weather to be wetter than normal, and a weak El Nino or an opposite effect, La Nina, will cause the weather to be drier than normal. And then we can use these connections to say something about whether we expect the season to be wetter or drier, depending on our predictions of El Nino. And what you see in this figure is that most of these regions that are highlighted in yellow or blue are in the tropics. And this is a very common feature among many of these teleconnections, is that they have the strongest effects in the tropics. So the tropics are the parts of the globe where seasonal forecasting is easiest. And then now, of course, sort of having to stick to this regime of taking averages over months or years can be a little bit strict. And we might want other types of information. And so I just wanted to show you an example of how we can tease out information from our data by taking different types of averages. There's a lot of averages in this talk, so be prepared. So here, this is out of a paper that was published in Nature Climate Change earlier this year by Sebastian Sippel and co-authors. So what they've done here is they've taken a different specific type of data product called a reanalysis, where we run a weather forecasting model and feed it all the observational information that we have. So we try to get an estimate of the weather at every single location on the globe through feeding the data that we have in the locations we have through the weather forecasting model. And then they look at two different time periods, 1951 to 1980 and 2009 to 2018. And then they look at every single grid cell on the globe and the daily temperature over the entire globe over every day in the period, and the plot a histogram. And then they standardize this so everything is comparable across locations and time. And we see that there's only a very small difference between those distributions. The more recent period is slightly warmer than the other one, but there's only a very small difference. Then if we move over to, instead of looking at the temperature in individual grid cells, we take the average over the entire globe. So we look at the global daily temperatures. And then we do this for the same periods. We see there's a huge difference between those two distributions. And so we see that basically someone who's born after 2009 will hardly ever see global daily temperatures like those observed in the period 51 to 1980. Now, of course, it's a bit difficult to talk about this in terms of that, because as a person, we never observe the global mean temperature. We only ever observe the temperature in the location where we're located on that day. So this also shows in some way the difficulty in describing and sort of relating to the effects that we can see in our climate. And with that introduction out of the way, then I have two topics that I wanted to go a little bit more into detail. First, I want to talk a little bit about how to evaluate climate predictions and projections, because those are sort of can be evaluated in very much similar ways. And then as a second part, I want to talk about if we can use statistical modeling or machine learning to improve the climate predictions that come out of the numerical models. So here's a quote from Peter Guttorp from a paper he published in Environmetrics in 2011, where he says that climate models are difficult to compare to data. Often, climatologists compute some summary statistic and compare climate models using observed, or rather estimated forcings, to the observed or estimated temperatures. It seems more appropriate to compare the distribution over time and space of climate model output to the corresponding distribution of observed data. Well, that was a bit of a long quote for a talk, but it has those two aspects that I find are very important. And one is this, that we have to compare the full distribution of output. And this is especially very important when we're looking at, say, extremes, because extremes are very rare and there is usually high variability. And then it's hugely important to look at the full scales of outcomes that we see. And the other issue is there in parentheses in the first part of this, that we never observe everything we need in order to fully evaluate the models. So the first thing we always have to do is to estimate the truth. And then we have to make a decision about which version of the truth are we using to compare the models against. And then the question is, what effect does it have on the results? Which truth do we pick? And we have an example of that here. So here we have two versions of the truth. We have a reanalysis, which is ERA5, which is a very recent high resolution, high quality reanalysis. And then we have an observational based data set called HADEX2, which takes station observations and uses an interpolation algorithm to go from stations to a gridded product. And we're going to look at this only over land in North America, because the HADEX only exists over land where there is a station network. And so we're looking at two types of extremes here. We're looking on the left, TXX is the daily maximum in a month, so the monthly maximum temperature. And we're interested in this only in the 3 summer months, June, July, and August. And then we do this over the period from 1979 to 2005. And then on the right-hand side, we have the similar variable, but for winter. So there we look at the minimum monthly temperature. And we do this for December, January, February for the same years. And then we take the average in each grid cell over all the years and all the months, and we compare the two data sets. And because ERA5 is a reanalysis that comes from a model, a gridded model, we expect, whereas HADEX2 comes from observations, we expect HADEX2 to be a little more extreme if there are differences between the two. And that would mean that if there are differences on the left-hand side, we should see blue grid cells so that there's even higher temperatures in HADEX2. And if there are differences on the right-hand side, there should be brown grid cells. And we see that this is almost the case, except that for TNN in winter, over the entire northern part of, the northern half of North America, we see mostly blue grid cells. And then we simply know that we're seeing something that we don't expect, but we don't know whether ERA5 is off or HADEX2 is off, or both of them. So this is a bit of an issue. And then we take this further, and We then find a performance measure that evaluates distributions. And we use a performance measure called the integrated quadratic distance, which just calculates the squared difference between two distribution functions and integrates over those differences. So if you know proper scoring rules, you know the continuous rank probability score, then this is the score divergence associated with the continuous probability score. So the two will give you the same model rankings. And then we have these two figures, examples of distributions, where on the left-hand side, they differ in the mean, and on the right-hand side, they differ in the spread. And the gray area is the difference that is integrated over squared. And so we see that this type of performance measure will be able to detect both the differences in the mean and the spread. And then comes a very complicated figure that we're just going to walk through. So here we have used the observational based data set HADEX2 as the truth. And we evaluate a large number of climate simulations. There are some climate models which names are colored in different colors. And those are climate models from an ensemble called CMIP5, which is the 5th generation of climate models, which was used in the IPCC report in 2013. And then we have climate models in gray with a star. And those are the new generation, the CMIP6 models, which are used in the IPCC report that is going to be published next year. And then on the top there, so the best simulation is a new version of the HADEX data called HADEX3, which not surprisingly is most similar to HADEX2 because it's based on the same data, just slightly different interpolation algorithms. And then we have 3 simulations in bold with sort of a box with an X, and those are 3 different types of reanalyses. And so here we see that it's not necessarily the case that the reanalyses are more similar to HADEX than the climate models. And in fact, one of them, the NCEP2, falls sort of in the middle of the pack. And so then another thing we did is we tested the performance. And so then we asked the question, is a climate model as good a predictor for HADEX2 as the reanalysis ERA5? And so if there's not a significant difference in performance between ERA5 and a climate model, then it is above the dashed line. And similarly for the other reanalysis, ERA interim, if a climate model is above the dashed dotted line, it is as good at predicting HADEX as that reanalysis. And so then now we can sort of make a lot of assumptions about these results. We can look at the colors of the CMIP5 models. If the models have a same color, that means they're from the same model family. So they have the same components, and we see that these are usually clustered, which is a good indication. However, we see that there seems to be no apparent differences between CMIP5 and CMIP6 models. And then we do another evaluation exercise where now we use ERA5 as the truth. And then we see that the CMIP6 models actually cluster at the top. So now all of a sudden, the new generation of models seems to be better than the old generation of models. And so we have to be a little careful in interpreting these results. And in particular, in this kind of exercise, it's a little difficult to pick a winner. And maybe the point isn't really to pick a winner because these are not supposed to be predictions, but projections. And so it's maybe more about detecting whether things are plausible or not. And so if we look at the very bottom of these plots, we see that there are some models that fall at the very bottom in both cases, and maybe then those models are less plausible than the others. So that could be another conclusion to draw from this exercise. Then on the climate scale, just a comment here, so that we generally work with anomalies rather than absolute values. And here I borrowed an example from NOAA that shows us why this is a good idea. So this is the average annual temperature at 5 different observation stations in Northern Carolina. And 4 of the stations are close to each other, and then the 5th station is in the mountains. And there on the right, we see the anomalies in 2008, sort of blown up. And the point here is that if for some reason the blue station were to fall out of the data set, if we were working with the absolute temperatures, we would see a huge change in the time series. Whereas if we're working in anomaly space, this would have only very little effect. So one reason to work with anomalies is that it really helps us with robustness, both of the evaluations and the predictions themselves. And then, of course, the question is, how do I calculate my anomaly? What do I use as a reference period? And here we did a little exercise just to look into how much difference does it make what I use as a reference period. So here we've moved in the world. So now we're in Europe, more specifically in Fennoscandia, which is the region that covers Norway, Sweden, Finland, and a small part of Russia. And we're looking at climate models where we have gone to a higher spatial resolution by nesting a regional model inside a global model. And we have 9 different models, and we're looking at distributions of daily temperatures in winter, so December, January, February, over a long time period, 1950 to 2005. And in the period from 1950 to 2000, we can define a whole series of different 30-year reference periods. So the first one starts in 51, then another starts in 52, and so on. And so we see here that, and then again, we use the IQD distance that was defined before as the performance measure. And so what we see here is that it really doesn't matter so much which of these 30-year reference periods we use. The results are pretty stable all over. But if we change the setup so that we instead use only 10-year reference periods, then we see that sort of everything goes a little bit haywire and the results are all over the place. So this is just to point out that we have to be sure that we're taking reference periods that are long enough so that we don't have natural variations that influence our results too much. And then that can be very random how they influence the different products. So to summarize this part, we should be comparing distributions, not just simple summaries. If possible, we should consider multiple versions of the truth. And generally, we want to work in anomaly space. Then over to the climate predictions. I just wanted to say a little bit about how this works in practice. So if we're interested in climate predictions, the first thing we have to do is to visit the climate data store, which claims to be the one-stop shop for information about the climate, past, present, and future. And so since late 2018, the climate data store has included climate predictions. And it now has climate predictions from 6 different meteorological centers around the world. And so if we combine all of these, we have an ensemble of climate predictions with about 200 ensemble members. And so how this works is that every month, approximately on the 13th of the month, for some reason, The new forecasts will be issued and available in the Climate Data Store. And those will then be forecasts for that month and the coming months. And then anyone can go and download this data and process them as they want. And then in post-processing climate predictions, we have a few challenges that are specific to those predictions that are less complicated in weather forecasts. Well, in weather forecasts, we also have very large data sets if we're working on a global scale. But here we also have the issue that even if we have a lot of data, the sample size is really small. And this is because we don't have really reliable observations until we have satellites. So the sample size is always limited to how many years there are since 1980. So with every new year, we have another data point, basically. And so because of this, so one sample is one season, and that's the reason then that we have such a small sample size. And because of this, post-processing methods must be simple, because if they're not simple, we risk overfitting our data. And then now we're moving into the territory of work in progress, but I just want to tell you a little bit about the stuff that we're doing right now with these forecasts. And so here is an example. This is the global temperature for sort of the mean monthly temperature forecast for October. So this month that was issued in September. And here are just two examples in anomaly space, where the anomalies are calculated with respect to 1993 to 2019. And there's on the left, there's a member from the ECMWF ensemble, and on the right from the UK Met Office ensemble. And we can see that there's some similarities. For instance, these two examples have quite similar El Nino or La Nina effects happening there. But if we look at Europe, we see that the ECMWF member says it's going to be a warm October, much warmer than usual, whereas the UK Met Office says it's going to be a little bit colder than normal. So we have this sort of, in some regions, for every month, we see that for some regions of the globe, we have a large spread and high uncertainty, where other regions of the globe, the whole ensemble is pretty much in agreement as to what is going to happen. And then we can look at the spread inside of each ensemble, so inside of each model, and compare that to the spread of the historical ERA5 reanalysis over the time period 1993 to 2019. And here we see that if we have a positive value, so brownish colors, then the model has a larger spread. Whereas if we have the blue colors, then the ERA5 historical data has larger spread. And we see that there's very much structural regional differences in the spread. So it seems like we can gain a lot by correcting the spread. And so now, of course, we're assuming that the ERA5 is our truth here. And that is because we're working on the global scale. So we need a global observation, and that we can get with a reanalysis. And another thing we can look at is the historical trends for each grid cell on the globe in the ERA5 reanalysis. And that we can see on the left. So this is the trends in mean October temperatures over the period 1993 to 2019. And the unit is degrees C per year. So we see that for, this is a very, very red map because there is a very large positive trend for most of the globe. except for very few areas, that are mostly located in the ocean and largely have to do with oscillations of large-scale processes. And then we see the trends that are calculated for the ECMWF model and the UK Met Office model. And we can see that the overall pattern is similar, but there are huge or substantial regional differences. For instance, if we look at the map for the UK Met Office model and we look at South America, it seems like something that should be potentially located over the ocean has moved into land. And furthermore, for example, if we look at Australia, we see that the positive trend is much stronger in the reanalysis than it is in the models. So then we can do a very simple correction of the climate predictions, where we can so do nothing. We just take an average. We can calculate the spread, so we can re-standardize and then take the average. Correct the trend before we take the average, or correct both the trend and the spread. And then what we see here is the mean squared error skill score compared to climatology, which is then the ERA 5 climatology. And so what we've done here is we looked at past, so hindcasts, which are forecasts issued for the past as if the past was unknown, for the years 1993 to 2019. And this is a sort of a leave one out cross-validation exercise. And then for each month, say in January, we issue forecasts for the next 3 months, so February, March, and April. And then the skill we show here for January is the average over the skill for those 3 months for which we issued the forecast. So the dot refers to the issuing month and not the validation month. But what we see is that there's a huge seasonal difference in how much skill we can gain over climatology. And there is overall, there's less to be gained in summer than in winter. But we see that there's a very clear pattern in that each step that we did in the post-processing will gain us a very clear advantage, and that holds over all the months and the issuing times. And then we can take the average skill in the other direction, and we can look at the average over all the different sort of lead times and time points for every grid cell on the globe. And then we have this map here where we see that there's a huge variation across the globe as to how much we can improve the prediction. And then we see this very clear pattern that the highest gain in skill is in the tropics. And this has to do with what I discussed earlier, that these teleconnections have strongest effect in the tropics, so the tropics are the part of the globe where it's easiest to do climate prediction. So we really see that coming out of the results again. And then we might be interested in slightly more detailed predictions related to our location. So here we did a little exercise where we looked at the city where I live, Oslo, and we tried to issue a monthly mean forecast for a observation station located in the center of Oslo. So we have here the horizontal dashed blue line is the average September temperature in Oslo, which is 12.2 degrees. And then we see sort of around that, we see the anomalies. So we see the individual temperatures that have been observed in the previous years. And then the orange line there on the right is the forecast that was issued in mid-August forecast that was issued for September. And we have the wider part of the bar is the 50% prediction interval. And then the full bar is the 80% prediction interval. And here we see that the median prediction and the observation are actually very close to one another. And this seems like a bit of a cherry picking. But the fact is that this was actually the first time we tried to do this forecast. We did this for another city in Norway as well. And so this is for the city of Bergen, which is on the west coast, so on the other side of the country. And here we see that this forecast is now within the 80% prediction interval, but they don't exactly agree. But it's still sort of work in progress is to see how robust this actually is over more locations and longer time periods. But I just wanted to give you an example of the type of forecast we can actually issue with these climate predictions. So then to summarize this part, climate prediction is very much work in progress. While the models have some skill, it's a bit limited still how much user relevant skill there is. That is, when we go out and we talk to potential users of the forecast, they usually want information that we are not very confident in giving them because we don't believe there's skill in the models to convey that information months into the future. However, it seems that with some relatively simple post-processing, we can substantially improve the prediction skill, and that's very positive. And then finally, I just wanted to say that this is a very active area of research. There's much room for improvement. This is a very new area of research as well. It's really until since the opening of the climate data store for seasonal predictions in end of 2018 that this area has sort of taken off. So there's a lot of room for forecasters that want to get involved. And then I just wanted to mention my collaborators. This is a collaboration with a lot of different people. And here are the 5 that have sort of done most of this with me. So on top row there, Jana Selman is a climate scientist who works at Cicero Climate Research Center in Oslo. And Erik Kolstad is a meteorologist at the Norse Research Institute in Bergen. And then I have 3 colleagues at the Norwegian Computing Center, Claudia Heinrich, Alex Zinkaski, and Marion Haugen. And we have these 2, so Pierre mentioned in the beginning this new center for climate prediction and climate risk assessment, Climate Futures. And there's a link there on the top right hand, and also to a new Horizon 2020 project we have where we're going to be doing climate services for Africa. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thordis. Very good timekeeping, very interesting slides, very interesting presentation. Now we have quite a lot of time, actually. I thought we would be a bit pressed since we had a slow start, but with your good timekeeping, we have time for discussion, so it's perfect. I could see here popping a first question in the Q&A box. All of you who are attending, you can post any question you think of. It can be directly related to the slide or something. I mean, Thordis was saying, you know, there's lots of interesting stuff, so we can open up also with different things. So I can read the first question, which is from James Mills. Thinking about teleconnections, presumably there is a continuum of physical processes that affect climate predictions, ranging from the transient micro to the enduring macro. How do you decide where to draw the line regarding which processes to consider versus exclude? Thordis?
Oh, very good question. Thank you. Yeah, so it's I mean, there are 2 ends, right? There's the process you want to model, because there's the process you want to predict, and then there's the processes you want to use to predict that. And then I'm not entirely sure which part you're asking about. But we try to do the simple. You try to do the model quite simple, because you can't have it be too complicated, because if it's too complicated, you're overfitting the little data you have.
I think, for instance, in terms of a low-level example, when you look at this kind of, I'd say, further lead times in terms of years ahead, right? You're not trying to model the clouds. We agree.
No.
Right. So,
right.
so I think that's exactly the question. You know, what do we feel are the processes that can be overlooked when we go at these scales, and what would be the processes that we just need to account for?
Yeah, and well, it's sort of how much do you need to average until you have something that has skill.
Okay, cool. But I think it's also, I mean, it's a question. I think there are, I don't know, dozens of researchers in physics of the atmosphere, the oceans, that are looking at that, actually, where you draw the line. Yes. And I think it's pretty much an open question that you could go to NOAA, ECMWF, and that you would have people who can contribute for hours discussing that. Okay, but the next question by Mahdi Fati is, how do you get climate data? I think you mentioned a shop. So
there's a shop. It's called the Climate Data Store. Yes. So the Climate Data Store is a Copernicus initiative that aims to centralize the access to all climate data. And so there you have the seasonal forecasts. You have the new climate model projections are going to be there, and you have the reanalyses data. No, it's a bit of work, of course, to navigate all of that and figure out what exactly do you need, because there's a lot of it. But the Climate Data Store is the answer.
Perfect. I did a link at the bottom right in the chat. It was very quick, so I hope it's the right link. But normally it's the Copernicus access to data page. So that should help. And I think you had it in one of the slides, so when the presentations are shared in the video, people can have also the actual proper link that you use. All right, another question by Jonathan Barish. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think I missed the point why the global temperature distribution deviates so much more than the local ones.
Yes, and that has to do with the fact that you have a much higher variability in general in local temperatures than when you take a large average, because you have the central limit theorem. Basically, you're pushing yourself towards the central limit theorem. And the other thing is that even if your local climate has changed, both your past and present climate might be found somewhere else on the globe in any given time. So that's the other reason for that.
Yeah. All right. I was thinking of something else. We can discuss it another time. Nikos also had a question. I'm wondering on your views on the interplay between models, forecast horizons, and supporting policymakers. Are there horizons that climate models are more skillful than others, or perhaps areas that traditional stats ML models may contribute more? Again, in the context of supporting policymakers. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a very, very good question, because it's very important that that people that work with climate prediction, we don't just sit there and predict whatever we're comfortable predicting. We have to try to give out some climate information that is actually useful for policymakers. And then there's a lot of very exciting work happening where people are using very advanced statistical models and machine learning, for instance, to model processes that you can't model in the climate models. And clouds is one of these. So clouds exist on such a small spatial scale that they disappear in the very coarse grid cells. And so you need to model clouds in a different way. And so then you can use historical information about clouds to apply a machine learning algorithm, and then you can put that on top of the climate model. And then clouds are very related to convective precipitation, which causes a lot of damage in a lot of places because it's this very heavy precipitation over very short periods of time that can damage your sewage system, for instance. And so the most important thing is to go out and talk to the policymakers, have a discussion and understand what they need. And then I feel like we have to be very careful in all our modeling steps is to account for all the uncertainties and try to be very precise in what we're doing. But we don't need to tell the policymaker about all of these steps and all of these uncertainties. They just need a number in the end. So we need to also be able to simplify the results so they're useful for people that don't necessarily want to hear about the whole process.
But building on this, I think it's very interesting. I thought you would mention a bit more this problem about decision under uncertainty. And I can see you're also looking at these kind of things with policymakers of all very practical problems. And building on Nico's question, I think there's two issues there, right? The first is to find actual problems where you can showcase the value of having this probabilistic information. And then that's where the link is to Nico's, how to make people to trust that you give them an information that is valuable, right? So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so so starting up the center, we've been going out talking to a lot of people and we've been asking them, what do you need? Everyone says extremes. They care about the extremes because the extremes is when something happens. So big thing that we're going to be looking into in the coming months and years is, can we really say something about extremes, the extremes we expect now to see next summer? And I'm not sure how optimistic I am that that's possible. What was the what was the
I was saying the second part was how do you make them trust your predictions, because that's a typical issue with decision makers, and especially with these predictions, is that there's a big question of trust for they actually use them properly.
And very often you need a chain of people. So you go from the researcher, or the climate researcher, to say a person with that kind of a background that works inside an organization who has then learned to talk to a decision maker. So it's not necessarily always that the climate researcher themselves should be talking to the politician. It has to go through a chain of steps.
They are too geeky anyway, in a way, for politicians. But I was thinking also what you've been telling us through these slides is also a lot about, what people say with machine learning. We want it to be explainable and interpretable. And by making all these studies also, you try to, I'd say, to give trust, because you tell people this is how it works, this is how it compares, this is why it says different things, because your truth is different and so on, right? So do you think also all this digging into the models, the data, what they really mean, is going to help also with trust somehow?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be able to explain what we see, and I think we have to be able to very clearly state all our assumptions, and we have to sort of kind of very clearly go through. Yes, so here is my prediction, but it's based on assumption 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
And so discuss whether that is reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sort of kind of.
I think you're right. I think we're gonna have to close soon. I had the last question actually. I was thinking, sorry, I'm a bit selfish with the mathematical aspects. You mentioned verification and small samples, and even now you say extremes, which makes things even worse, right? So what do you see as some kind of more mathematical forecasting and verification challenges that we should attack here for the specific problems?
Yes. So what are robust ways of assessing things, so that if you only have but it's also one thing we also see a lot is that you have this different climatic conditions lead to different sort of received skill. If you're trying to issue a precipitation forecast and you're in a part of the globe where it never rains, that your forecast says it never rains is not necessarily a good forecast.
I think it links perfectly to what we saw by Robert in the Q&A box. Surely for most consumers of model forecast, they trust if they predict salient event, right? And
Yes.
so yeah, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but that's what you're answering at the same time, right?
Exactly.
Good.
So we need to, yeah.
No, continue, sorry.
Yeah, so verification measures that are able to account for the inherent predictability of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be, it's a slightly different way of thinking about it.
Yeah. A last question, maybe there's an anonymous attendee. There can be a sense of helplessness about reacting to climate model predictions for the far future. Can climate predictions help make climate change more relevant to the here and now? So it's about somehow internalizing this information, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, if we can, so as an individual, it feels very difficult to react to something you know is going to happen in 80 years from now. And there's sort of, what can we do? There are parts of society where that is very important information. If you're going to build a bridge, you expect it to last for 80 years. And then you need to design the bridge to the climate you're going to see in 80 years from now. Of course, that doesn't help with, we also need to fix this problem we have. And having climate predictions that will tell you these here are the most sort of are the issues you're going to see in the next 3 months, then maybe we can take small steps and it will help us to prioritize things, I think. In that sense, let's fix now the issues that we're going to face in a few months, and then, you know, then we can move over to the next thing. Yeah,
so it's prioritizing the different timescales somehow, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Good. But yeah, I think we need to close now. I see it's the end of the hour. Thank you so much once again, Thordis, for this very nice talk and the discussion around it. Thank you all for attending this talk. I think you have one last chance of doing something with the ISF this year, is the practitioner track now. And after that, there will be the closing of the conference. So thanks to you all once again. And yeah, see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.